This lecture has been made available to you courtesy of the American Numismatic Society.
So today we're joined by Jonathan Barth, who's an associate professor of history at Arizona State University, where he also serves as associate director of the Center for American Institutions. He holds a doctorate in history from George Mason University and has written several pieces related to the history of money and politics in early America, including his first book, The Currency of Empire, Money and Power in 17th Century English America, which was published in 2021. Today, Jonathan will be speaking with us about an element of the currency wars in colonial America. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, John.
Thank you. Well, hello everyone. It's the morning here in Arizona, but good afternoon to the rest of you. I'm going to screen share here. Is that coming through okay?
Yeah, I can see it. Yep, perfect.
Great. Well, it's an honor to speak to all of you. Thank you for taking time out of your Friday afternoon. And the American Numismatic Society, it's engaged with it quite a bit on and off over the years, and the work of Eric Newman and in your great archives and photographs and that I've been able to use in some of my work. So really appreciate this opportunity. And like Ryan said, I've in 2021 I published with Cornell The Currency of Empire, Money and Power in 17th Century English America. And the basic gist of the book is that English concerns over money, especially the money supply in England, were at the forefront of imperial state development in the 17th century and became a major source of conflict between the mother country and the colonies during that period. And I focus a lot in the book, and then also an article that you see pictured there that was published with the William and Mary Quarterly on mercantilism as one of the chief organizing principles of English colonial policy. And the goal of mercantilism, in short, was to steer overseas trade so that the mother country, in this case England, would enjoy trade surpluses and therefore an influx of gold and silver into England. The issue is it placed the colonies and the colonial monetary system in a subordinate station, and this in turn prompted resistance in the colonies to many of these economic regulations. Like I said, I published an article on that topic of mercantilism in William and Mary Quarterly. 2 years before that, in 2014, I published there we go. A separate article on the Massachusetts Mint, which some of you may be familiar with, in the New England Quarterly and the Pine Tree Shilling. And so this is a subject, money, that I'm very fascinated with. I teach at ASU a course called History of Money. Very broad course, of course. But I've taught this every fall semester for the last 10 years. It's very popular, especially among the business and business students and students of finance majors. And we start with the ancient world and then proceed pretty quickly through that. And then in the second half of the course, we hone in on the history of the US dollar. And I put this, actually recorded the lectures to this course and put it on YouTube. And so anyway, that's my flagship course at ASU. Before we proceed with the talk, one of my goals as a historian is to present monetary history to an audience untrained in economics and finance. I think monetary history can be a bit intimidating for a lot of people. And as a result, it's a subfield that is neglected by much of the historical profession, including academic historians. And one of my approaches has been to weave political history and social history into the narrative and highlight how actually the history of money is deeply embedded in a wide range of historical topics. I find the history of money interesting for its own sake, but even so, you're going to have a hard time understanding certain key episodes in the history of politics, the history of war, the history of social movements, economic change, if you don't understand something about the money, how it worked, how it changed over time, etc. And so that's my my deal in the academic history world. Today's topic: colonial currency devaluation via changes to the legal shilling value of foreign coins in the colonies. This topic would appear on the surface to be extremely obscure and tedious to most colonial and academic historians, but it's not. And I'm sure with the audience we have here, you won't need convincing on that point. But Ryan and I were talking prior to this meeting, and a lot of very smart academic historians look at this subject and they're like, I don't know, this is very complex. Well, it was actually extremely important. Now, it's well known that American colonials, including merchants, farmers, debtors, tradesmen, and government officials, struggled continually in the 17th century and into the 18th century to obtain an adequate and reliable supply of currency in their respective colonies. Colonials expected, more or less, a reasonably functioning monetary system. It's a reasonable expectation. Okay, money is central to an economy. You need it to facilitate exchange, and so they wanted a monetary system. The problem: the English imperial system never provided American colonials with an adequate medium of exchange. The Crown forbade, for example, the establishment of colonial mints. And in fact, when one colony, Massachusetts, established one, the Crown did everything they could to shut it down and succeeded. The export of English coin from England was also unlawful. And until the 18th century, paper currency was not yet a ready alternative. Colonists instead relied on a confusing and wide array of foreign silver coins of sundry weights, finenesses, origins, and quality. Colonial governments had no control over this currency except in one vital area: the legal shilling value assigned to each foreign coin. In the era before paper currency, altering the shilling value of foreign coins, including most prominently the Spanish piece of 8, was the primary method by which a colonial government could exercise even the slightest control over its monetary system. These shilling values varied depending on the colony, and in fact, rates often dramatically differed from one colony to the next. Because the action that raised the shilling value of foreign silver coins also definitionally lowered the value of the shilling as a unit of account, the procedure was, in effect, a type of currency devaluation. Currency devaluation became an explosive issue in the colonies in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. And again, I'm talking about the era before paper currency really took over. The first paper currency was in Massachusetts in 1690, but it wasn't until about the 1710s that it predominated in most of the colonies. It was currency devaluation, coin valuation that was the main issue. This controversy inflamed intercolonial jealousy and resentment, as we'll see. Second, it prompted a decades-long conflict between the mother country and the colonial governments over the extent of colonial control over monetary affairs. This conflict resulted in the Crown's attempt to enact administrative reforms to centralize imperial power over the colonial periphery, including in the sphere of politics. And as we'll see, when Queen Anne issued a royal proclamation in 1704 to standardize the rates for silver coin in America, many colonies flatly refused to obey the royal proclamation, necessitating the first currency act from Parliament. Many of you may have heard of the Currency Act of 1764, some of the currency acts from the mid 18th century. The first Currency Act was in 1708 and was about this issue. Even then, after the Currency Act of 1708, many colonies resisted putting Parliament's act into execution, as we will see in this talk. Only with the widespread adoption of colonial paper currency in the 1710s and 1720s did the controversy surrounding coin valuation finally ebb. So that's the introduction. What was this controversy all about? The most common coin in colonial America, as probably all of you know, was the Spanish piece of 8, known also as the Spanish dollar. It weighed about 27.5 grams, just shy of an ounce, and was about 93% fine, meaning it contained about 25.5 grams of fine silver. And that varied over the centuries, but during our time period, that's about what it weighed. And there were differences between the mint in Peru versus the mint in Mexico and Seville. Won't go into all those details here. Between 1520 and 1810, the lucrative mines of Mexico, Central America, and Peru produced an extraction of silver worth about 3.5 billion pieces of 8. Now, when I say 3.5 billion pieces of 8, not all of this silver was minted into pieces of 8, but had that been so, it amounted to about 3.5 billion pieces of 8. So a lot of silver coming out of these mines in the 16th through early 19th centuries. Most of the silver ventured outside of Spanish America. European states and England required the reminting of foreign coin before the money entered circulation. But because the law did not prohibit the use of foreign coin in colonies, the piece of 8 became the most commonly used coin in British America. And there were other foreign coins that circulated in British America, Dutch, French, Portuguese, and others, but the piece of 8 was the most common. And actually, the piece of 8 remained legal tender even into it was the Coinage Act of 1857, where the piece of 8 was no longer legal tender in the United States. In using foreign money, American colonials preferred familiar English units of account, shillings, pounds, and pence. Colonial governments, therefore, had to assign a legal valuation for this coin, specifying the number of shillings and pence at which the coin would circulate in the colony. Because the silver content of the piece of 8 approximated the silver content of 4 shillings 6 pence of English coin, the colonies in the beginning rated the Spanish dollar at 4 shillings 6 pence. Beginning in the 1640s, however, and into the early part of the 18th century, colonial governments recurrently increased this legal valuation. It was, in essence, an effort to increase the quantity of money in the colony, both nominally via the number of shillings, but also in real terms by encouraging outsiders to spend their silver in that colony. Almost immediately upon devaluation, and again, that's when the colonial government declared that the piece of 8 was now going to be worth more shillings than it had been previously. Immediately upon devaluation, the price of imported goods rose in rough proportion to the devaluation. Merchants required the same quantity of silver as before to buy merchandise from abroad, and so by necessity, they charged a higher shilling price when selling that merchandise to colonial consumers. Prices for domestic goods rose later. If a bushel of corn was 4 shillings on the eve of devaluation, it usually remained 4 shillings in the weeks following. Only later, perhaps in a few weeks or a few months, did prices for domestic goods rise in rough proportion to match the higher shilling price for imported goods. The price lagged behind for only a season, but while it did, its effect was quite enormous. During the transitory lag period in price inflation, imported goods became comparatively expensive in the colony, while domestic goods became artificially cheap. This, in turn, caused a temporary influx of silver coin into the colony from abroad, as outside money holders brought that coin to the colony to purchase artificially cheap domestic goods. It not only stimulated exports, but it added temporarily to the colony's money supply. Eventually, domestic prices adjusted and this phenomenon ceased, but in the meantime, it had this transitory effect and it proved very alluring for many colonial governments. Many colonial officials came to believe, besides, that they had no other choice but to devalue in order to counteract the negative consequences of devaluation from a neighboring colony. So if one neighboring colony devalued its currency, you felt pressure as their neighbor to also devalue, lest your coin fly to your neighbor. This temporary stream of coin into the devaluing colony often came from neighboring governments transferring silver from one colony to another. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, private proprietary colonies like Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Carolina often used devaluation like a magnet to attract coin from other colonies, especially from royal colonies who had no freedom to counter with their own devaluations. European powers for centuries had used devaluation to attract money from rival states and rival empires, but here, in this instance, we have an example of competitive devaluation within the same empire. It caused a lot of headaches for the mother country, and it caused a lot of intercolonial quarreling. The first colony to devalue was Massachusetts in 1642, and this came in response to a deflationary depression that had resulted from the breakout of the English Civil War. The Massachusetts General Court raised the dollar from 4 shillings 6 pence to 5 shillings, an augmentation of about 11%. Connecticut followed in 1643 and also matched the 5 shilling rate. By the 1650s, Virginia and Barbados had also set a 5 shilling rate on the dollar. And then in 1652, Massachusetts took things further and devalued again, raising the coin another 20% to 6 shillings for a dollar. And they did that via the Mint Act. Won't go into all the details on that. England during this period paid little mind to these early devaluations. The 1640s was a decade of civil war in England, and then the 1650s were a decade of inner turmoil with Cromwell and then overseas wars with Holland and Spain. Then in the 1660s, the restored crown was concerned mostly with securing and reasserting royal authority and rule, and so colonial devaluations continued in this early period into the 1660s and early 1670s without any molestation from England. In 1671, the Jamaica Assembly, dominated by sugar planters, raised the dollar from 4 shillings 6 pence to 5 shillings, effectively reducing the debts they owed to the Royal African Company by 11%. In 1671, the Maryland Assembly raised the dollar by 33%. From 4 shillings 6 pence to 6 shillings, all in one fell swoop. Nevertheless, 5 years later, the proprietor, Lord Baltimore, who was concerned about his revenue within the colony, repealed the statute and returned the dollar in Maryland to 4 shillings 6 pence. In 1672, the governor of New York raised the dollar from 5 shillings to 6 shillings in order to compete with Boston. And then lastly, New Jersey devalued the shilling beyond any other, assigning the dollar in 1676 a value of 7 shillings 8 pence, which was roughly 70% above rates in England. Beginning in the 1670s, the Crown assumed a much more hostile posture toward colonial devaluations. Here we see pictured King Charles II. Now, King Charles II, as a man, as a person, did not actually involve himself too much in the day-to-day administrative responsibilities, but his ministry did. And they were, during this period, 1670s and into the 1680s, the Crown assumed this more hostile posture toward devaluation. This shift occurred in the context of a major transition in the style of imperial governance during this period, one that embraced centralization of power. The disparate forms of colonial governments, charter colonies, proprietary colonies, royal colonies, increasingly vexed imperial officials who desired direct royal control over America. The commissioning of the Lords of Trade in 1675 heralded this change, and the Lords of Trade was under Charles's ministry greatly opposed devaluation. Currency devaluation departed sharply from accepted practice in England at that time. Most economic thinkers in England adamantly opposed devaluation, just as general policy, and they were no doubt influenced by King Henry VIII's notorious and far more nefarious devaluations in the previous century. It's known as the Great Debasement. Since 1601, the pound sterling remained constant as a unit of account without any alteration in value. And so competitive devaluations in England's colonies undermined the new imperial agenda after 1675. The problem for the crown was there was very little they could do about it because many of the colonies were not under direct royal control. In the 1680s, a new wave of colonial devaluations ensued, and they were inspired in large measure by the swarms of buccaneers or pirates who came to the North American coast to spend plundered Spanish silver. Pirates were more likely to bring their Spanish dollars to a port that valued them at 6 shillings apiece, or better yet, 7 shillings apiece, than say 5 shillings apiece. If you're a pirate and a pirate ship that had hundreds or even thousands of pieces of eight, the difference between a 5 shilling rate in one colony and a 6 or 7 shilling rate in another was pretty enormous. In the early to mid 1680s, colonial governments competed over which province could offer pirates, as well as legal traders, the highest shilling value for their pieces of silver. In 1683 alone, 4 colonies, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Carolina, raised the piece of 8 from 5 shillings to 6 shillings. And in 1684, the New York Assembly raised the dollar from 6 shillings to 6 shillings 9 pence. Many of the coins brought in by the pirates were clipped. And all of you probably know about clipped coinage during this period, especially before the era of the milling press. But this is where pieces of silver were cropped from the edges of the coin, sometimes as much as a quarter to a third, or even half of the coin could be clipped. And pirates brought in a lot of clipped money. Either they clipped them themselves or they just obtained it secondhand. An unclipped or full weight dollar contained 17.5 pennyweights of silver, but clipped coin was often as light as 15 pennyweights or even 12 pennyweights. Some colonial governments allowed clipped monies to pass at face value, known as currency by tale. Other colonies deployed a sliding scale of valuation that deducted a certain number of pence for each missing pennyweight. Pennsylvania, Barbados, and Pennsylvania and Barbados valued currency by tale, while New England, New York, and Carolina valued currency by weight. Hence, if you see here on the chart, the Pennsylvania valuation for coin was in actuality far higher than what the 6 shilling rate at first glance would suggest, because the law in Pennsylvania was that was 6 shillings for clipped money. In 1688, New York lowered the piece of 8 to 6 shillings, but changed from currency by weight to currency by tale, matching Pennsylvania. Barbados also valued clipped and full weight money at equal rates at 5 shillings. So the governments in New England and Carolina, on the other hand, rated full weight dollars at 6 shillings and then deducted a certain number of pence for each missing pennyweight. So here again on the screen, you'll see New England is 6 shillings and New York and Pennsylvania are also 6 shillings, but because New York and Pennsylvania valued it by tael, that was clipped money, New York and Pennsylvania actually had a higher shilling rate for Spanish money than New England. In the 1680s, money passed at the highest rates in the middle colonies, at slightly lower rates in New England, and at the lowest rates in Jamaica and the Chesapeake. And the Chesapeake is a general term including Maryland and Virginia. During this period, the Crown recurrently vetoed bills in Virginia and Jamaica to raise a dollar to 6 shillings. The Crown had a veto over any bill that was passed by their assemblies because they were royal colonies. In Maryland, the proprietor also vetoed all such bills. And so Maryland, Virginia, and Jamaica were behind their counterparts. In 1688, King James II was forcibly abdicated his throne, and the Glorious Revolution placed the monarchy or enthroned William and Mary. The Glorious Revolution changed a lot about English governance, but it did not alter the crown's hostility to the practice of coin or currency devaluation. And so in the 1690s, this continued, and the crown's hostility also continued, notwithstanding the Glorious Revolution. In 1693, New York raised the coin to 6 shillings 7 pence. And in doing so, they actually went back to currency by weight. A few months later, Pennsylvania raised the coin to 7 shillings and switched from tael to weight. In 1696, Connecticut became the first New England colony to break the 6 shilling threshold by advancing the full weight dollar to 6 shillings 9 pence, with deductions for each missing pennyweight. Soon after Connecticut did that, colonial merchants in nearby Boston began on their own accord to accept clipped money by tael, a move they had never before taken. This amounted to a de facto devaluation of the currency in Massachusetts. Under the new charter government in Massachusetts after 1689, any law passed by the Boston Assembly had to be approved by the Crown. That wasn't going to happen. And so the merchants extra legally coordinated together and voluntarily compacted to accept clipped money at 6 shillings apiece. In Jamaica, after repeated failures to increase the coin to 6 shillings, the merchants of Port Royal also agreed voluntarily to accept clipped dollars at 5 shillings and full weight dollars at 6 shillings. Now, in England, as many of you are probably aware, there was a huge debate about devaluation in 1696, and it was called the Great Recoinage. And pictured there on the left, you see the Secretary to the Treasury, William Lowndes, and on the right, of course, is John Locke. In short, in England, the early Tudor and early Stuart coinage was just horrendously clipped. It needed to be recoined. Some of these monies were clipped by as much as 1/2. William Lowndes, Secretary to the Treasury, estimated that although the clipped coinage in England amounted to about 4 million pounds face value, the coins actually only contained 2 million pounds worth of actual silver. Lowndes recommended recoining at a new standard with a devaluation of almost 25%, but the Whig ministry in England was persuaded by Locke, who advocated recoining at the old standard. And so the ministry's preference for Locke against devaluation then informed this continued hostility toward devaluation in the colonies. And in fact, after 1696, there were loud cries for a reformation of this issue in the colonies, of this issue of the valuation of coins. There were calls for a single common standard of money across colonial America. Imperial administrators in the Board of Trade wished to convert all of the privately run colonies into royal governments. And in advocating that position, they cited these competitive devaluations as a really big problem for England. Shockingly, in 1698, the Pennsylvania Assembly raised the full weight dollar even further, from 7 shillings to 7 shillings 10 pence. This new rating was 75% higher than the rating in Maryland, their southern neighbor. So look at that. Maryland is just south of Pennsylvania. In Maryland was basically trapped at 4 shillings 6 pence. And in Pennsylvania, it received a valuation of almost 8 shillings. And so during this period, this petition after petition from Maryland planters and Maryland assemblymen to England saying, look, this is a huge problem. Our coin it's hemorrhaging north to Pennsylvania. In 1700, the Carolina Assembly raised the value of a full weight dollar to 7 shillings 7 pence, though this was almost immediately repealed by the proprietor. Virginia and Maryland during this period urged the crown to intervene as they were again hemorrhaging money to the north and the south. In 1703, the Board of Trade recommended to Queen Anne a royal proclamation to secure a single standard for coin across colonial America. The Queen's Attorney General assured them that all colonies would have to abide by the proclamation. Because there was a question, because again, many of these colonies were not royal colonies. Would they have to abide by the Queen's proclamation, even though they're not royal colonies? And the Attorney General said, yes, they will. So the Queen issued a proclamation on June 18th, 1704. And according to a proclamation from the 1st of January next, no full weight Spanish dollars shall be rated higher than 6 shillings apiece anywhere in America. So it set a ceiling at 6 shillings for full weight dollars. Moreover, according to the proclamation, coins must be valued by weight, not by tale, with appropriate deductions made for each missing pennyweight. The proclamation, in theory, would force Pennsylvania, Carolina, and New York to lower their respective ratings for coin while permitting, presumably, Maryland, Virginia, Jamaica, and Barbados to raise their valuations to 6 shillings. 400 copies of the proclamation were sent from London to America. The governor of Virginia even ordered that the Queen's proclamation be posted at all churches, courthouses, and public buildings. The Queen's proclamation from the beginning was utterly ineffectual. There were no enforcement mechanisms, just the mere command of the Queen on pain of royal disfavor if it was ignored. Well, that's not much of a for the colonies to disregard it. The proclamation, for some, would require a significant reduction in the shilling value of a piece of 8. Such a stark appreciation in the value of the shilling would result in a temporary trade deficit that would cause silver coin to flow out of the colony and would also force debtors to settle their shilling-denominated debts with a greater sum of coin than that at which they had contracted. In Massachusetts, the Assembly, despite the governor's urging, refused to pass any law punishing the practice of accepting clipped money by tale at 6 shillings. In New York, the governor asked the Board of Trade to exempt the colony from the Queen's proclamation because, he said, Massachusetts and Pennsylvania have not yet submitted. And if New York were to go first, it would lead to, quote, the infallible ruin of this province, ruin beyond recovery, end quote. Pretty strong language there, but he was probably correct if New York were to act alone and not the others. The Board of Trade, upon hearing this petition from the New York governor, very reluctantly approved the governor's request for a delay until Pennsylvania and Massachusetts complied. Of all the colonies, Pennsylvania proved the most egregious in its response to the Queen's proclamation, not only refusing to implement the order, but in fact doing the opposite, raising the dollar even further to 8 shillings. It's not a major change from the previous rating, but still pretty brazen. One might expect that at least Virginia and Maryland enjoyed finally a higher rating for Spanish coin. Not so. The Queen's proclamation did not necessarily compel a 6 shilling rating if the present valuation was lower. In 1705 and 1706, the governor of Virginia twice refused to sign a bill from the assembly raising the full weight dollar to 6 shillings. The assembly was utterly baffled. Here, the Queen had appeared to give a green light to a 6 shilling rating, and still the governor refused to sign. In Barbados, too, the governor refused to sign a bill raising the dollar to 6 shillings. The Queen's proclamation had completely failed. The next step was an act of parliament with penalties affixed for disobedience. On April the 1st, 1708, Parliament passed an act for ascertaining the rates of foreign coins in America, the Currency Act of 1708. According to the Currency Act of 1708, beginning in May of 1709, if any person in the colonies received foreign silver at a rate higher than 6 shillings for a full weight dollar, all such persons shall either suffer 6 months' imprisonment or pay a fine of £10 sterling money, which was equivalent to approximately 33 pieces of eight. What a stiff penalty. Still, the main obstacle was getting the colonies to authorize this new currency legislation, or to authorize new currency legislation that fell within the regulations. How do you do that? This was still a problem. In Massachusetts, merchants continued accepting clipped money by tale at 6 shillings apiece long after the 1709 deadline set by Parliament. Not until 1712 did the governor, owing to heavy pressure from the crown, issue a proclamation severely penalizing the practice. In New York, the assembly not only did not comply, but, like Pennsylvania after the Queen's proclamation, did the opposite. They raised the price of silver to 8 shillings an ounce, which placed the full weight dollar at 7 shillings. The Board of Trade was furious and actually recalled the governor for signing the bill. Still, the assembly refused to budge, and the 6 shilling regulation never went into effect in New York. The Pennsylvania government, fearing a royal takeover of the proprietorship, complied with the new regulation in 1709, lowering the price of the full weight dollar to 6 shillings. Simultaneous legislation in Pennsylvania abated debts by 1/4 in order to account for the appreciation, and the Assembly also ordered an immediate universal reduction of all prices in the colony by 25% in order to avoid the temporary lag period in price movements. Finally, in 1708, Maryland achieved the new 6 shilling standard. Barbados achieved this standard in 1711, and in Virginia, after a long struggle between the Assembly and the governor, a compromise statute in 1710 priced the full weight dollar at 5 shillings 5 pence. The Assembly wanted that 6 shilling rate, and that was the best they could get. Later in 1727, the Virginia Assembly raised the dollar to 5 shillings 10 pence. I will also note that Virginia, of all the mainland colonies, was the last colony to adopt a paper currency, and that wasn't until 1755 in the context of the French and Indian War. After many decades sparring over the valuation of coin, the controversy by the early 1710s finally seemed to have come to a rest. This was not owing to complete or even partial compliance from the colonial governments, but rather to the sudden introduction of paper currency emissions on a vast scale. Paper money by the 1710s had rendered the issue of coin revaluation largely irrelevant. Massachusetts had emitted paper bills of credit since 1690, and you see there an original I think this is a facsimile of the 1690 note. But for some years after 1690, Massachusetts was alone in utilizing paper currency. South Carolina adopted paper money in 1703, followed in 1709 by New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, and New Hampshire, and in 1710 by Rhode Island. These emissions helped to finance the colonial side of the War of the Spanish Succession, known in the colonies as Queen Anne's War. With paper bills of credit, colonial governments exercised far greater control over the local money supply than they had in the era of competitive devaluations. Parliament was never able to secure full compliance to the Currency Act of 1708, but paper currency replaced coin valuation as the prevailing monetary controversy thereafter. Imperial officials initially tolerated the paper medium because it financed the colonial side of the war against France. In the late 1710s and 1720s, however, imperial support for colonial paper money evaporated, and thereafter, monetary policy again became a point of immense controversy between the mother country and the colonies, resulting in fresh rounds of currency acts in Parliament in 1741, 1751, 1764, and 1773. But all of these had to do with paper money, not with coin. All the while, the inaugural Currency Act of 1708, which presaged the conflict, the forthcoming conflict over paper money, faded from significance, becoming a forgotten, though highly combative at the time, episode in colonial economic and political history. And I'll conclude there and take any questions that people may have.
Hi, Jonathan. Jesse Kraft here. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I do have a question. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can. Is that
Excellent.
okay that I stop the screen share, Ryan? Or is that okay? Okay,
Thank
good.
You had mentioned the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and the 1680s were also a very tumultuous time in the colonies themselves. Were there any particular events in any of the colonies that played into the currency devaluations of the 1680s in particular?
Yeah, so during good question. Prior to the Glorious Revolution, King James II had attempted to basically revamp all of colonial governance and did away with all the New England charters and consolidated the New England colonies under a single Dominion of New England. And it was under the executive headship of Sir Edmund Andros. And when Andros became governor, the merchants came to him and asked for him to confirm a new devaluation in Boston, and Andros refused, citing the typical English objections to devaluation. And so pretty early on in the Dominion of New England, Governor Andros, uh, found himself at odds with the merchants in Boston, so that in 1689, when word of the Glorious Revolution came to Boston, Andros had no support. And when the public rose up against Andros's administration, the merchants, the wealthy men in the colony, were more than happy to assist in the overthrow of Andros. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it's perfect. Thank you so much. It was yeah, definitely a crazy time for sure.
Yeah.
Question: do we have good time series data on wages and prices for this period? Like, what was the cost of a pig or a cow? What does a laborer make in a day?
Yeah, very good. I wish we did. It's can be a bit sparse. I should have given a shout out to John J. McCusker's book is excellent. Money and Exchange in Europe and America. This was a major source book for me. And he addresses some of that. We don't have very good price data. You can search the record books and find at well, so one alternative to before paper currency, one alternative to coinage that the colonies adopted for monetary reasons was they gave a shilling value to farm produce, and in Virginia to tobacco to be used as a medium of exchange. And so in Massachusetts, for example, if you didn't have coin, you could pay your debts or pay any or your taxes. You could pay it in bushels of corn, or in Virginia, you government officials received their salaries in pounds of tobacco. And so those commodities were given specific rates, and so yes, we do have price data for that. As far as labor, it's we have much. It's a little harder, more difficult to track. The records aren't quite as detailed. I'm writing my second book right now on the Continental dollar during the Revolutionary War. That's my next project, and I've completed most of the research for that. And I'm in the early stages of writing, and the data we have in the 1770s and 1780s is a lot better than what we have in the 17th century. The 17th century is a bit difficult to ascertain specific prices, but yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, Richard Green here, if you can hear me.
I can.
Two questions. Who were the issuers of the paper money? And was the paper money exchangeable for coin?
Thank you, Richard. These were authorized by the Assembly. I think in all cases, I'm trying to think of a case where it wasn't. They were all authorized by the Assembly. They weren't issued. There were no banks at that time. You had land banks, but even the land banks were a creature of the legislatures. These were what we would call fiat money. They were not backed by anything but taxes. So usually the legislature, what they would do, they would authorize a specific emission of paper notes. The colonial treasurer would have the notes printed and then would spend the notes on whatever public expenditures it may be. In wartime, there were plenty of expenditures to cover, or during peacetime on infrastructure projects. And usually in the legislation, actually always in the legislation that authorized a new emission, the legislature spelled out, okay, every year, this percentage of the emission will be taxed and will be taken back in. And then there were public burnings, like bonfire burnings of the notes, in order to show the people, okay, like the notes have been retired. So it had that backing, you could say, but it was not redeemable. It was not redeemable in coin, no.
Thanks.
You could exchange it for coin, and actually, one handy thing in McCusker's book here, if you're interested in the subject, it's a great book. McCusker charts the exchange rates, but it wasn't redeemable in the sense of you can go to the treasurer and receive coin.
Yeah, so we have a question in the chat. Roger's asking, was the changing valuation of the shilling between colonies a direct result of the Spanish dollar valuation?
Let's see. Well, so like I said, the Spanish dollar, the silver content was equivalent to 4 shillings 6 pence of English money. And so that was sort of the baseline rate that the colonies had to go by. And then after that, like it was really from there, colonies, and it depended on, how independent was the colony from England. Virginia wasn't. Virginia had to have all of its bills approved by the crowns, and the crown wasn't going to approve it. But in colonies that were relatively independent of English control, they had the freedom to take rates wherever they wanted, and some of them did. Here we see a difference between intrinsic value and extrinsic value. The intrinsic value of the coins were 4 shillings 6 pence of silver. The colonial governments, by changing the legal shilling value of the coin, didn't change the intrinsic value. They altered the extrinsic value of the money, and it's a form of currency manipulation. And it doesn't have any, it wasn't a lasting solution to any economic problems, but by its very nature, it did have a transitory effect, and that's why some of these colonies pursued it.
Any other questions?
Yes, Ray Williams here. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Okay. I have a question. I just want to clarify that if you had two adjacent colonies, say one is valuing the 8 real at 7 shillings, the other at 6 shillings, could you actually purchase a number of these 8 reals at 6 shillings, hard currency, go to the other colony and sell the 8 reals back for 7 shillings and make a quick profit? This is something that's been confusing, and I've tried to explain in presentations using the United States and Canada that both of us have dollar denominations, but they are not equal. And I kind of relate that to the colonies as being little tiny separate entities with their own currencies using similar nomenclature, but of differing value. And I still find it very confusing.
Yeah, great question, Ray. And so I would say my answer to that would be, again, you have this this period where ultimately after the colony devalued, all prices within a colony would rise in rough proportion. You'd have inflation, but it didn't all occur. It didn't occur equally or evenly in the immediate aftermath. Eventually, prices in the colony that had devalued would sort themselves out. And so if you have one colony that was at 7 shillings and the other colony at 6 shillings, in this sort of transitory lag period and price movements had already passed, if you attempted to go into that colony that had a 6 shilling valuation and trade for Spanish coins, whatever good you were trading for those coins, like let's say you brought tobacco to the colony, the price of tobacco in the colony with a 6 shilling valuation would be less than the price of tobacco in the colony was set that rated the dollar 7 shillings. And so there will be like a price differential in whatever commodity you're using to purchase the coin at 6 shillings. And so it would, now before prices evened out, there would be this period where, yeah, you could take advantage of that, and people did, which is precisely why you had colonies like Maryland and Virginia like hollering at the crown like, this is not fair, or like Maryland especially. Maryland really had a problem. I mean, the coin was just like, every time Pennsylvania devalued, coin again hemorrhaged from Maryland to Pennsylvania. Eventually things evened out though, because prices in Maryland were lower than they were in Pennsylvania.
Breed. Fermented dairy products like cheese.
I don't know if that answers, your question. It sounds like you've thought a lot about this too. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah,
there you go.
Yeah, I have, and it's very confusing. And when people ask me questions, I don't have all the answers figured out in my head, but I normally have something that's good enough to get by somewhat accurately. You've obviously studied a lot more on this topic, and I have a lot to learn from Jesse also. But yeah, it's a fascinating time period to study. Thank you for the talk.
Sure, you're welcome.
Hey, this is Bill. I'd like to follow up on that question. So if there really was just this transitory period and then prices would basically compensate for that, what was the point? I mean, what did it really achieve anything in the end, or was it really just chasing your own tail?
Yeah, and great question, Bill. And actually, at the end of the day, there wasn't much point. That was the argument put forward by the opponents of devaluation in England. That was Locke's argument in 1696. There were a lot of English writers in the 17th century writing on the subject, and they all said, no, this is like a huge fallacy that you can't just increase wealth by declaring, oh, if we just declare this coin to be double the number of shillings that it was before, we'll be twice as rich. It doesn't work like that. And so in the long run, no, it did not have that any real lasting effect. It was in the short run, however, and that's why also some of these colonies that would devalue, they usually didn't. They kept doing it. Like it was a recurring thing for some of these, like Pennsylvania, New York, and because like the example you used with Pennsylvania and Maryland, once things evened out, well, yeah, your Spanish dollar receives a higher price in Pennsylvania, but prices for everything in Pennsylvania are higher, and prices for everything in Maryland are lower. So, in order to kick that back in, Pennsylvania would have to do another round of devaluations, and you'd have a period where the economy is manipulated again. But in the long run, that's that's not how you create wealth. Just like fudging around with the currency. That's not how wealth is created.
And before we get to Chuck's question, I just want to ask John, what is the name of your YouTube channel if people want to find your classes on the history of money?
Right. Yeah, sure. Professor Barth. Just type in Professor Barth in YouTube. I have the history of money, my history of money playlist. I put it on there during the COVID era, actually, as like a creative way to provide an alternative to my students, and ended up putting the lectures on there for free. So I think it's like 90 lectures or something.
Wow.
They're usually about 20 minutes in length. But that's all there. The playlist is there if you're interested.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
And then Chuck is asking, just thank you for a very informative and historically significant presentation. What was the name of the book that you recommended a few minutes ago?
Yeah, I'm not sure how easy this is to buy nowadays. I got this like a while ago, but it's a John J. McCusker, Money and Exchange. Yeah, Money and Exchange in Europe and America. It's not a narrative book. It's like just a lot of data. So if you just want like hard price data, especially for the currencies, different the exchange rates, and again, not just in America, but in Europe, this is a really excellent resource. John J. McCusker is one of the few academic historians who wrote a lot about money in the late 20th century.
Okay. Well, we're about at the end of time, so thank you very much, Jonathan.
Looks
really
like Franklin
Yeah,
may have
I just had one quick comment.
Yep.
Thank you very much. It was a great talk. Sometimes I feel like Don Draper from Mad Men, who used to store cash in his desk drawer. And there's a great episode where his wife says to him, "You don't have a clue how money works." And sometimes I feel like that. And I think that's sort of like what mercantilism is all about. The powers that be didn't understand how money worked, and this has been very enlightening to help us understand how money really works in economies.
Yeah,
So
and
thank you.
yeah, thank you, Franklin, for that comment. Yeah, you're right, and it only gets more and more complex. I mean, then you enter the 20th century with like the Federal Reserve and all that. It's just it always becomes like hopelessly complex after a while. But you're right. It's very significant though. It has a large impact on just. I mean, money is it's it's the most important, what do you want to call it? Like item, trade good in the economy, bar none. I mean, it just doesn't it compares to no other good or item in the economy. And so of course the money that is absolutely central to not just the economy but to political systems. It's how we finance wars. And yeah, it's a subject that I think merits more greater attention. And um, actually, in recent years, there has been greater attention to monetary history, and the people at American Numismatics Society can probably attest to that as well. Especially now with we have all these new like cryptocurrency, and then after the 2000, actually it was the 2008 financial crisis that first got me interested in monetary history. I watched as, the stock market started to like really fall, and then all of a sudden the Federal Reserve came in with quantitative easing. I'm like, what the heck is that? And I like really, it took a few years to just study everything. And because I was already a graduate student in history, I was going to write on a totally different subject. This is like 2008, 2009. And I said, you know what? Why don't I like completely forsake this other thing I was going to do and study monetary history, because you know there's a lot more that could be said about it in the literature. So
Okay. Well, yeah, thank you again, Jonathan. Like everyone has been saying, this is really fascinating presentation. I feel like I learned so much about, just the situation of all the different colonies that I hadn't really realized before. Um, so very valuable.
Ryan,
Thank
can I
you.
say one final thing I saw in the chat? Yeah, $90 for. I think I got this one for like $20 a decade and a half ago. I think it may be on, if you're looking for the book, it may be on archive.org. And it's pretty common in libraries too. So if you look on go on WorldCat or something, and it may be at your maybe a library at the local college or university if you're interested in that book. We should have a reprinting of it.